Hello everyone, my name is Joris Schröder. I'm a PhD candidate at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and also the Dutch blood bank St. Queen here in Amsterdam. I do research on the question how social influences and social relationships affect pro-social behavior. And I look at blood and plasma donations as one very good example to study pro-social behavior. But at the same time, I'm also trying to feed back the knowledge to organizations such as blood banks to potentially improve donor retention and donor management more generally. I'm very happy to be able to participate at the Donor Research Network's Symposium series for 2022. And yeah, a big thanks to all of those involved for organizing. And in my short presentation that follows, I'll be talking about social influences on the compliance with solicitations for blood donations. Okay, so I'll be presenting this project, which is joint work with my supervisors Eva Maria Merz, Bianca Suernet, and Pamela Wiebking. So the motivation to look at compliance specifically comes from the fact that many forms of pro-social behavior are actually highly institutionalized. So in the real world, pro-social behavior is often facilitated by organizations which are kind of the middleman between donors and the recipients of blood, for example, but also of monetary donations, or in the case of volunteering, then the kind of a time transfer. And pro-social behavior in the real world is therefore often the product of generosity of individuals, partly, or maybe other individual motivations, but also the product of the collection efforts of organizations. And one of the most important tools and the most widely used tools of organizations are direct solicitations for donations. So just asking people to make a donation. And these have been shown to be very effective in the case of blood donations, but also monetary donations or volunteering in previous studies. So first of all, why do we care so much about compliance? A bit of the background on the blood collection system in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, we have one organization that collects all the blood products, which is St. Queen, and they do this via voluntary and non-remunerated donations. And the process works like this, that you sign up to be a blood donor, and after that, it's kind of a solicitation-based system. So you usually get an invitation that just asks you to make a donation. If you're registered as a donor, you get these invitations, and then on the back of the invitation card, it states a date from which on you can come to make your donation and the location where the collection site is that you should go to make your donation. And this is usually the one that you register at, which is close to where you live or close to where you work, usually. So what this then means is that the system looks kind of like this. We have individuals who on the one side receive invitations to make donations, and on the other hand, they are kind of nested within collection sites where they make their donations. And we have two types of collection sites in the Netherlands. The first are these fixed collection sites where people go at a building that is specifically equipped to collect blood. And on the other hand, we have these mobile collection sites, which are trucks that show up at a village where people are specifically invited to make a donation at one day where this truck shows up in the village, usually in more remote locations than the fixed collection sites. So what do we know so far about social influences on pro-social behavior and also blood donations? So we have a lot of evidence from the lab. So lab studies where people conduct public goods games, for example, where they contribute to a common pool of resources, and in the end, the resources are distributed among participants. And what we see here is that, for example, communication is one of the easiest strategies to increase the contributions in such public good games. So in general, in social settings, contributions are usually much higher than in completely asocial settings where people cannot communicate or cannot interact with one another. What we know for blood donations is that people are more likely to make a donation if others, and particularly relevant others, also donate. So particularly partners seem to be influential contacts for your seem to be influential on your donation behavior. But what we've also seen in this very recent study by Goethe and Tripodi is that recognition that is very broad, so recognition by other people at the other side of the country, for example, just a general group of other people, does not seem to motivate blood donors. So this kind of social influence does not seem to work, but the close kind of social network influence seems to be there. But what we know very little about so far is how these things affect compliance. And as I mentioned before, compliance is very important in this setting because blood donations in the Netherlands have this solicitation-based systems, and solicitations are generally one of the most important tools for retention. So our research question is then how the connection between individuals and their social environment, so the kind of social influence, how that relates to their compliance behavior. And the way we conceptualize this is within a social ecological systems model, and that allows us to conceptualize this interaction between the social context, which in our case is the collection site, and then also the individual decision maker and how the interaction process looks like. So in very brief, the assumption of this model is that individuals perceive the social environment. So they get kind of new information from the people around them, for example. Then they evaluate this information among the different choices of behavior that they have. So for example, whether to comply or not to comply, they make a selection of behavior, and then they execute one of the behaviors. And that then again is affects the social context, because of course your decision is the kind of social context for the decision of another donor. So we hypothesize within this framework how social influences on compliance might look like. And our first hypothesis is that for the perception of an individual, the recruitment process might already matter. So we hypothesize that the probability of compliance is higher for donors that were recruited via word of mouth in comparison to people that were, for example, recruited by the blood bank, or people that signed up on their own initiative. So recruitment via word of mouth, we predict to increase compliance. Our second kind of key variable that captures the connection between individuals and their environment is talking about blood donations. And we here hypothesize that the probability of compliance is also higher for donors that talk more about blood donations. And the underlying theory for these, or the assumptions for why this should be the case, is that if you are recruited by others, or if you talk more about blood donations, then you're more likely to be subject to positive social influences of others in your surrounding. And then we further hypothesize that this should be particularly the effect at mobile collection sites. And that is because these have an event-like character, because they show up in your village one day, and you're also much more likely to meet people that you know at these mobile collection sites. Because it's just one specific time point and usually in a more remote place. So we hypothesize that the relationship between talking about donations and compliance is actually stronger at mobile collection sites. So then within the next kind of decision-making process of evaluation of this new information that you might have gotten from the behavior or the talking to other donors, for example, we assume that the relationship between compliance and talking about donations is stronger for those with lower altruistic values. And this builds on previous experimental literature, where it has been shown that particularly more egoistically motivated individuals are affected by social influence in comparison to altruistically motivated individuals who are more likely to give anyway, or to contribute to a public good anyway, in comparison to people with lower altruistic values. So we hypothesize that talking is particularly motivating for those with lower altruistic values. And finally, we hypothesize that the selection process is at one part deliberate, so it depends on your individual attitudes and motivation, but the other part is habitual. And therefore, we hypothesize that the relationship between compliance and talking about donations is weaker for more experienced donors. So that means that as you gain more experience with the system and with the behavior, you make more donations. These kind of external influences, such as, for example, social influences, that they become less important. And for that reason, talking about donations will also be less relevant for more experienced donors. So we also pre-registered these hypotheses and also an analysis plan about the empirical approach that I will be talking about next. So the data that we use comes from two main sources. The first one is the blood bank information system by the blood bank Sanquin, where all the invitations and also the donations are recorded. And then a large survey that was conducted in 2012 and 2013, where approximately 34,000 donors were surveyed. And our sample is then all the solicitations to donate whole blood that were sent out in these 2 years, 2012 and 2013, to the donors that we have in our sample for the survey. And what this then leaves us with is about 150,000 solicitations that were sent out to about 23,000 donors that donate at 164 collection sites. So the most important variables that we have from these two sources is, first of all, compliance. So this is based on the register data, the blood bank information system, and this records whether a donation was made within 4 weeks after receiving a solicitation to donate whole blood. And because we use this 4 weeks interval, we capture people that come to make a donation slightly before the 2-week interval and people that come to make a donation slightly after the 2-week walk-in period that you usually have at fixed collection sites. And it also captures those that come to donate at mobile collection sites. But what it excludes is people that might have gotten a second invitation, because usually if you don't show up for your blood donation, then you get another invitation rather sooner than later. The first construct that captures connection to the social environment is word of mouth recruitment. And this was elicited with the question, what made you decide to become a donor? And here we code those as word of mouth recruitment that said that they were recruited by friends, family, and acquaintances, versus those that decided to become a donor on their own initiative or that were recruited by the blood bank, for example, via brochures that the blood bank distributes or other recruitment activities by the blood bank. The next variable is then talking about donations, which was just elicited with the question, how often do you talk to those around you about blood donation? And the answer, the response options were never, occasionally, regularly, or often, encoded as 1 through 4. For altruistic values, those were measured with 3 items on a 5-point Likert scale. And one of these items is, for example, it's important to me that I help others. And finally, we have a variable that captures fixed or mobile collection sites from the blood bank information system, and also a variable that captures the experience of blood donors as just the number of previous donations that they have made. We use a 3-level structural equation model with a probit link to model this binary decision-making of whether or not an individual complied. And we have these 3 levels of the solicitation level, then the individual level, where we have all the information from the survey and the registry, and then the collection site level, where we, for example, look at whether a site is mobile or fixed. So for covariates, we include the sociodemographic variables and also general values. So for example, the age, the sex, the experience as a donor, but also working hours or awareness of need, for example. So these more general values and also altruistic values. And we secondly include a bunch of more blood donation specific factors. So those are, for example, effective attitudes towards blood donations, then the satisfaction with the blood bank, and also whether you would rather want more invitations or whether you would like to receive less invitations. So these are included as our main groups of covariates. So now for some descriptive statistics first. Overall, we can see that about 57% of the invitations are followed by donations. So that means the compliance rate is about 57%. And we can also see that we have basically the whole range of the distribution within our data. So we have some people that never comply with a solicitation to donate, and we have others that always go, but we pretty much also have everything in the middle. So everything between never comes and comes all the time, basically comes every time. On the collection site level, it looks like this. And what we can see here is that we basically have a little bit higher compliance actually at the mobile collection sites rather than the fixed collection sites, with the mean at the fixed collection sites being about 56% and at mobile collection sites about 62%. So if we now look at the relation of the compliance at the individual level with whether people were recruited via word of mouth or not, we can see that there's basically no difference. So we can see that while about 45% of donors, or 11,000 in comparison to 13,000 people, were recruited via word of mouth, so while it does seem to be a relevant recruitment channel, there is actually no difference in the compliance between the people that were recruited via word of mouth and those that were not recruited via word of mouth, so via any other channel. But if we now look at the level of talking about donations and how that relates to the compliance, we can see that there's a pretty linear increase with in the compliance with the level of talking about donations. So donors that never talk about blood donations have only about a 50% compliance. Donors that occasionally talk about blood donations have about a 57% compliance, and donors that regularly talk about donations even have about a 65% compliance. And then we have a very small group of donors that says that they often talk about blood donations, and they again have a little bit of a lower compliance. But in general, for the most part of the responses, we see this linear increase in the level of compliance by the level of talking about donations. And this is basically also what our model then confirms. So here on the top, we can see that word of mouth recruitment is not statistically significantly associated with compliance, but talking about donations is, and our model estimates that a 1 unit increase in the level of talking about donations, while taking into account the covariates, leads to about a 3 percentage points increase in the level of compliance. So what does this mean for the hypotheses that we stated in the beginning? So first of all, we do not see hypothesis 1 confirmed, so the compliance does not differ between donors that were recruited by word of mouth and those who were not. However, talking about donation does seem to predict compliance, so hypothesis 2 is in line with the data. We do not see significant interactions with whether a collection site is mobile or fixed, and we do also not see a difference in the relation between talking about donations and compliance for people with lower or higher altruistic values. So this is not in line with what we hypothesized with hypothesis 3 and 4. What we do see, however, is that talking about donations is most relevant for novice donors. So this is shown in the figure on the bottom here, where we can see that people with less experience, for them, talking about donations has a relatively strong association with compliance. And as people get more experienced, or as experience is higher for people, the association between talking about donations and compliance gets weaker and weaker. Okay, so what do we make of this and what do we conclude? First of all, it seems that the perception of the social environment matters for compliance. So more specifically, talking about donations predicts compliance behavior, while the recruitment channel itself does not seem to matter. In line with our hypothesis and also the previous literature that has shown that social or more external influences on behaviors should become less relevant as donors become more experienced, in line with this finding, we also find that this social influence of talking about donations becomes less important as donors gain more experience as blood donors. And that is likely because they form a habit of this behavior, and therefore the other influences become less important. And another interesting result that is somewhat in line with previous literature is that we do not see an interaction with altruistic values. And I say somewhat in line with previous literature because we have seen that compliance in general is not very well predicted by altruistic values, And that is likely because donors are already selected based on their altruistic values to register as a blood donor. Therefore, among the sample of already altruistically motivated donors, there does not seem to be a large difference in what that does to compliance. And we also do not see the difference in the effect of talking about donations on compliance between people with lower or higher altruistic values. And this is not what we found on previous experimental studies that looked at pro-social behavior more generally, but it is in line with the finding, with the previous finding for blood donations, that altruistic values seem to be less relevant for compliance. So what does this then mean for blood banks? So one important aspect of why we also focused on compliance is that blood banks are particularly dependent on this responsive donor pool, because it is, first of all, more efficient to manage, and also because blood products are usually not they don't have a long shelf life, and therefore you need to kind of be able to predict how many people will follow your invitation. If you invite, for example, a specific number of donors, how many are likely to show up, and how can we improve that? And one way that seems to be promising is to target the communication about the topic of blood donation among blood donors. Although one limitation of our design is that we do not really provide causal evidence. So the thing that we would like to do next is to look at the causal effect of providing opportunities for talking about donations to donors, to see whether this external increase in talking about donations then actually increases the compliance with solicitations for donations. Okay. So if you have any further questions, then please email me to the email address that is on your screen right now. And if you want to read the full paper, you can scan the QR code, and you will be landing at the OSF page, where you can find the pre-registration and also the full paper if you want to have more details on everything that I talked about right now, and also many more interesting analyses. So to wrap up, thanks again to all of the organizers and all of the people involved at the Donor Research Network, and especially thanks for letting me present today as well, and for giving me the opportunity to share my work.